all relationships have ruptures. The durability and resilience of a relationship is a function of how you navigate the rupture and repair. And because our society tends to be so focused on fast fix and instant gratification, when ruptures happen, we have a tendency to walk away instead of to tending really well to repair. I think that's part of the Earth's assignment to us right now, is how do we repair within ourselves, among each other, and with the Earth. One of the systems errors that we as humans tend to make is to think that people who think like us are smart and people who don't think like us are not. And actually, nature shows us over and over again that the most resilient ecosystems are the ones with the greatest diversity of species.
Welcome back, and hello to all of those of you that are with us for the first time. This week, we have our first interview of the year, which is a beautiful and a timely one. I know that many of you are concerned and upset around current world happenings, from the unbelievable bushfires in Australia to the Iran-USA situation. I'm glad that you're here, as this interview and the others on this show offer space to discuss the complexity of our times. I host these conversations because I believe that we need them to find our way as the world keeps turning, and we need to keep learning how to respond and be part of it. I know many have been saddened by how many animals have died in the bushfires in Australia, 500 million. I was researching how many animals are killed per day around the world for the food that we eat. I found that it's 200 million land animals per day, and when you add in wild caught and farmed fishes, it gets closer to 3 billion animals killed per day for the meat, dairy, and fish industries. One thing that is alive for me is the differing perspectives that exist on where we are. For example, the research that Harvard professor Steven Pinker has done shows that global violence has decreased over centuries, and the rights of women, children, and people of color, for example, have grown. This doesn't change the poverty, chaos, disaster, violence, and enslavement that we're experiencing today, but it does show that so much is possible and that evolution is happening. At every time in history that humans have been here on Earth, living their lives, loving their families, and sharing their work, we've had wars, disasters, and poverties. I think that for some that grew up in the West in the 80s and 90s, like myself, there was this sense of peace and possibility, of disaster and violence being something that was very far away, which has been challenged a lot over the past 20 years. The world has become more connected and smaller in ways, and there is nowhere in a complete bubble anymore. I know it's challenging to know how to contribute and find your way to show up, both in your inner world and your physical reality. This month, on our membership platform, Presence Collective, we are exploring the theme of sacred activism. This is a big one and will combine work and research I've been doing over the past decade, along with tools and wisdom that has emerged through these conversations with some of the incredible guests that we've had. I see both this podcast and Presence Collective as offering a much needed practical and philosophical education piece that actually tunes us up to what this time is calling from us, as well as focusing on the key elements that our culture and traditional education systems don't teach us or seem to value. The sacred activism work will look at how to contribute both through your inner work as well as how you show up as an activist. We'll look into skills like cultivating courage, presence, and resilience, as well as looking into how reactivity and stress and anxiety can be disablers and the importance of vision. You are so welcome to join us, and we'll be able to get either the Sacred Activism course alone or join Presence Collective, where you get access to everything in our library and be part of an incredible supportive community. I'm still giving away intuitive therapy sessions as well to those who join on an annual membership this week, which allows you to shift some subconscious patterns and plant some new seeds within. All info is on our courses page at www.thefutureisbeautiful.co. And as ever, thank you to our patrons, especially our newest ones, Matija Mazi, Ron Doby, Alicia Roscoe, Vianne Idan, and Maxime Longden. We couldn't do it without you. If you love this show and want to support us this year, please go to our community page and join as a monthly patron. We have our monthly video call this weekend, which is always such an enriching time, and I would love for you to join us. My guest today is Nina Simons, who is an award-winning social entrepreneur and visionary thinker, and the co-founder of Bioneers, which is an innovative non-profit organization that highlights breakthrough solutions for restoring people and planet. Their conference has been going now for 30 years, and it's a space where leaders and students alike in this field gather to learn and share. They also are creating so much wisdom and bringing that out into the world through the articles on their website and their videos, which I highly recommend. As a co-founder, Nina created the Every Woman's Leadership Program and has helped to lead years of identifying, gathering, and disseminating breakthrough innovations that reveal a positive and life-honoring future that's within our grasp today. Nina's work currently focuses on writing and teaching about women, leadership, diversity, systems thinking, and restoring the feminine in all of us. She leads workshops, speaks widely, consults and hosts convenings that create the conditions for transformative awakenings. Nina edited the anthology Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart, which contains 30 essays by over 40 contributors who collectively help us redefine the leadership landscape. Her new book is Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership, which won 2 Nautilus Awards upon publication, one in the category of women and the other in social justice. Before our conversation starts, we share the audio from one of the Bioneers videos which features Nina, called As We Open Our Hearts. I hope that you enjoy this conversation and it moves and stirs your tender heart. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful.
As crucial as they are to illuminate a future landscape of hope, all of the innovative environmental solutions and strategic social models alone won't be enough to alter our collective course. What's ultimately required is a change of heart, a shift in how we relate to each other and to the whole of the living earth. How then can we enhance and accelerate our learning about conscious kinship? Well, first it might help to stop idolizing rational intelligence to the exclusion of our other capacities. A wealth of additional information could be available to us if we also valued the abundant physical, emotional, and intuitive cues we all receive. Fortunately, we have an abundance of relational intelligence to learn from, if only we can humbly accept its tutelage. The natural world is resplendent with symbiotic, long-term reciprocal relationship between blossom and pollinator, moisture and mycelium, plants and herbivores. In nature, no one lives in isolation, and the sense of balanced interdependence is palpable in any thriving ecosystem. We can opt to be mentored by its mastery if we can quiet ourselves long enough to hear, smell, feel, and learn from it. May we practice being still and really listening to ourselves, to each other, and to the gentle whispers of the ancient intelligence of the living earth. If we can do that, we will build a contagious energy that will ultimately lead to real healing and restoration, the restoration of our wholeness as a global community, of our deep and fundamental interdependence with each other, with other species, and with the whole interwoven web of creation. So as the Lakota people say in ending every prayer, Omatakiosin, to all our relations, Amen, Ah woman, and Aho. Thank you.
I am absolutely delighted, Nina, to welcome you to The Future is Beautiful. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so happy to be with you, Amisha. What a pleasure.
So this was my second Bioneers just recently, and the first one that I came to was 7 years ago, and actually ended up being quite a poignant moment, as just before, like literally 2 days before, I had shaved my head for the charity Womankind Worldwide, and I was thinking about how women, especially in war zones, have their heads forcibly shaved a lot as a weapon. And I was an ambassador for this charity at the time, and it just, things just happened, and I was like, I have to shave my head. It was like a very clear bit of direction. And the strange thing is that I had this live head shaving event, and then the very next day was on a plane to San Francisco. So I didn't have that experience of being around people that I knew with the shaved head. I was at Bioneers. And so it was interesting being back now, 7 years later, and kind of seeing that significance of a personal cycle. And also seeing how the space of Bioneers, of environmental based leadership, how that's changed over 7 years as well. And I found this experience very, very moving and very connected to the feminine, and very connected to our hearts and that aspect of our courage.
Well, that makes me so happy to hear, Amisha, because that fulfilled an important part of my intention in terms of my own contribution to the program and design of it. It just feels like the place we're in as a species calls us to a different level of feeling engagement in our mass sort of process of decolonizing our minds and hearts and recovering from cultures of white supremacy and all of the conditioning and patriarchy, all of the conditioning that we've been shaped by, often without our awareness. So it felt to me like this is a time when, in a sense, we need to be pierced by the recognition of how serious where we are is, and shaken out of a sense of complacency through feeling our communal challenge and the love that's possible to help carry us through. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like that's a theme that I am noticing again and again, like these challenges of this time. If we're isolated with them, it's too much for each of us to bear.
Yes.
But if we come together in community and we inspire and hold each other and allow us to fulfill our own parts of the story rather than have to be everything, that then it feels like there is a way to hold this time with courage and integrity and possibility.
I think that's so true. You know, that part of our way through is by reclaiming the wholeness of our humanity. And so much of what the truth of our humanity is, it seems to me, is that we are fundamentally social creatures, who thrive in community when we give ourselves permission to let our guard down, to be authentically who we are together, and to feel, because I feel like part of what's really gotten in our way is the tendency to stuff down our emotions and to avoid or bypass or ignore the depth of grief, of loss, of feeling, of anger, of all those emotions that I do believe nature has endowed us with for good purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that we actually need the cleansing that experiencing those emotions can give us. We need the water of emotion to flow through us in order to meet the challenges that we're facing. And we can do that better together than alone, I think. Yeah, I think we're kind of designed for it.
Yeah, beautiful. In these 30 years of hosting this space of Bioneers, and through that getting to spend time in deep conversation with many people that are committed in very different ways to this time, this challenge, this great turning, what is it that you see like has been shifting, and where do you feel like the greatest kind of opening is for us now?
Well, obviously, I can only respond through my own lens and my own experience. But I guess what I would say is that, in terms of my own understanding, what's apparent is that what we understand leadership to be is really changing. And that much of the leadership that we need to be honoring in the greatest way right now and supporting and having their backs is the leadership of First Nations peoples, of people of color, and of women and of young people. I feel like Indigenous peoples are carrying the seeds of the information, the traditional ecological knowledge, and have embedded in both their cultures and their life ways keys to how to live in a changing environment, and also how to survive hundreds of years of attempted genocide. And I guess what's true for me, Amisha, is that in my own process of emergence or awakening over the last 30 years, as I peel away layers of conditioning that I think has come through systems of patriarchy, of neoliberalism, of capitalism, and of racism, what I find is that privilege consistently confers blinders, and that the areas of inquiry that are magnetizing me in the biggest way have to do with how do we as a species really get better at valuing difference instead of othering through difference, and also really take on the work of healing our inner landscape in the interest of healing the landscape between us and the landscape between us and the Mother Earth, because I see them as all octaves of the same inherited social imbalance. So I'm really interested in somatic approaches to healing trauma and story-based approaches that can simultaneously help people on an individual level to access more of their own capacities and to feel a greater acceptance of the truth of the beauty of who each of us are, but also simultaneously can weave people into community in a way that is trusting and authentic and vulnerable and real. Because as you said earlier, I think part of my experience with death recently and with facing the amount of loss and challenge that we are facing globally, it takes a village, and we need to be. One of my favorite quotes comes from Sarah Crowell, who is the artistic director of Destiny Arts, this amazing after-school program that teaches young people both self-defense and self-expression through the arts and dance. She says, the way to hold it together is not to hold it together in that scrunchy way, but to actually hold it together. My sense is we're all healing from Western civilization, and in some cases in the global South, being more directly impacted by Western civilization and traumatized. I feel like we're entering a keyhole in which humility is one of the most greatest values I know how to practice. I find myself always in a balancing act between, not a balancing act, but in a balancing process between honoring what I know and what wants to come through me, and recognizing how much I don't know, and staying really humble about that. I don't know, that's sort of a long and windy answer to your question, but it's a big 30-year arc. And in many ways, I feel like Bioneers has been through a process which we as a species are going through, which is a process of learning to lead from the heart rather than from the mind.
Yeah, I love the long and windy answer, and also very precise. What are some of the practices and the tools and the ways of being that in your own life have helped you to be open and to be more in your heart?
I think that I've always chosen to grow myself by identifying role models that inspire me. And sometimes those role models have been people that I know personally, but other times they've not. Sometimes they've been authors whose writing has opened new doorways for me. In terms of practices, I think one of the greatest, I think of this like my interior maypole or the center of my compass. I experienced a very long ritual, which was offered by a traditional Peruvian practitioner, maybe about 10 years ago. And the ritual was like 6 hours long and very elaborate and very ornate. And it was happening at an equinox. And at the very end of the ritual, he said, if you remember only one thing from our time together, remember this. And he offered 9 words. And the 9 words have become the center of my compass point. And they are: consciousness creates matter. Language creates reality. Ritual creates relationship. I felt as though those 9 words sort of got invisibly tattooed into my soul as instructions. And I started experimenting with them. Particularly, I think the one, consciousness creates matter, is helpful to me in terms of strengthening my commitment to setting intention and to investing and believing in the power of intuition, of dream time, of the invisible world to affect change in the manifest world. But the one that's really, really hooked me was ritual creates relationship. And so I began experimenting with creating rituals for myself. Like, for example, I realized that when I got out of the shower in the morning and looked at my naked body in the mirror, I had these little voices in my head that said, oh, your belly's too round and your hips are too wide and your butt is too big, and all of those negative voices. And one day I realized how much I was perpetuating harm to myself by doing that. And so I decided to create a ritual where I made up an essential oil. I made up a body oil and I scented it with 3 essential oils that really resonated for me. And I thought, okay, instead of doing that every morning, I'm going to oil my body for all of the 2 or 3 minutes that it takes. And as I oil my body, because I live in the desert, so it's necessary, I'm going to pour love into my body. I'm going to hold the intention of just appreciating this body so much for the way it contains who I am and the way it serves me and for its beauty. And so that was a simple example of a ritual that I made up, and I've made up many of them since then. And what I typically find, Amisha, is that somewhere around 4 or 5 weeks, I do them every day. I hold myself accountable to doing them every day. Around 4 or 5 weeks, my cynic kicks in, and I say to myself, oh, come on, do you really think this is going to make any difference? And then I let it float by and I keep doing it. And somewhere 2 or 3 weeks later, I start to notice a difference. Mm-hmm. And so I have found that a tremendously helpful practice in cultivating myself towards who I want to become. And the other thing that came up as you were asking this, because I have had the joy of partnering with a woman that I co-facilitate workshops with. And her name is Deborah Eden Tull. And she is a woman who lived for 7 years as a monk in a Zen monastery. And she was also a sustainability person before she even went into the monastery. When she came out, she realized how valuable the practice of mindfulness had become for her, mm-hmm. and how much she had learned. But she also realized that the way she had learned it felt too patriarchal to her and too masculine. She has gone through a process of kind of redefining mindfulness and wrote a book about it called Relational Mindfulness. And as I went through the 4 or 5 month journey of helping my mother through her end of life this summer, the practices of relational mindfulness were what kept me grounded and present and helped me more than anything else I could identify. So I'm finding those tools incredibly helpful right now. Thank you. That was a beautiful question.
So much in there. And when you said the rituals are relationship or relationship are rituals, it really, that one, I felt it so strongly. And the images that came up for me were around community, but also around romantic partnerships and how by making space for ritual, for very sacred time together, where you're connecting on a very deep and purposeful, intentional level, and that can really support in getting too caught up in the day-to-day and the, has the washing been done and has this bill been paid and those aspects. And it's and I hadn't thought about the rituals for ourselves, but this is for me, as you were saying it, but for me it's like this is so much a part of just what has always, ever since I've been a child, like this desire to honor things and to gather people in ways where we could, just really honor the sacred. And of course I didn't have that language as a child in the town in the middle of England that I grew up in and didn't have the traditions. And through my adult life, there's been this reclaiming of that desire to bring people in the space of ritual. And it's one of those things that's hilarious because my family, like as in the family that I was born into, just don't have any patience or joy for these kind of things. And for me, I just, I love like people to be gathered around a table and to invite a question that everyone answers, or whatever it is, but to create these spaces and that we can come together in and bring that part of ourselves. And I think of this podcast as a ritual, that we're coming into a ritual ceremonial space together, and we're inviting everyone, all of our friends and community listening, to take that time as well. That just because it's a podcast, it doesn't have to be a intellectual, listen to it on your commute kind of thing, that it can be an experience of the heart and of connection.
It's beautiful. The other thing that I would add that I love about ritual is one of my favorite nicknames that I've ever been given is Nina Nexus, because I love the place where worlds meet. And what I find about ritual that I love, in addition to everything you're saying, is that it's a place where traditional cultures' understanding of meets modern neuroscience. If I want to grow myself in a particular direction and I promise myself and then hold myself accountable to doing something every day, it actually helps create a new neural pathway, which is what neuroscience is proving is how we grow our minds and our capacities, and I love that combination of like, yeah, we can alter our mindset. We can alter our worldview. We can alter our perceptual abilities or our inner story. But part of it is practice, just like anything else. Yeah.
It's making that effort to show up for ourselves and for each other and for the greater turning.
Yeah.
And it's the best way as well to rebel against this super fast culture.
Right? Which, frankly, there are so many amazing innovators and change makers I know who are burning themselves out in response to the speed and the need, which are so great right now. And we need to regenerate ourselves. We need the feminine and the stillness in between to inform our best ways forward. Yeah.
So you mentioned the feminine, and I know that this is a big piece of your journey and the work that you're offering. Can you share what feminine leadership really means?
Thank you for asking. When I refer to the feminine, I do it with at least dual awarenesses, one of which is that for people of different generations and of different cultures, the feminine is a loaded word and has different meanings. For me, when I speak to the feminine or the deep feminine, what I'm actually alluding to is that deep archetypal quality that informs the ancient Chinese figure of the yin and the yang, of the complementarity of the receptive and the active, of the what's above ground and visible and what's below ground and invisible. And what has often been referred to as the dark and the light, although I'm wary of those words anymore as I'm aware of how racialized a culture we have. But it's way beyond women and men. I believe that we all have feminine and masculine in us, regardless of our temporary gender assignment, and that we've all inherited cultures that have an over valuing and an over reliance on the quote masculine in us, in our human capacities, and a tendency to undermine or undervalue the quote feminine. And I say those quotes because I think we've all inherited some pretty corrupted or twisted definitions of the masculine and feminine, and that we're all trying to find our way back to what's a healthy definition. What I know in myself is that I aspire to live in a way that gives me a full toolkit and access to an entire spectrum of my human capacities. If you imagine them as a spectrum of masculine to feminine or feminine to masculine, I want to have access to everything I got all the time. And what better way to meet a time of challenge and turbulence than to have access to all of our human capacities. And I also, I guess for me, when I began to learn about the burning times, which is that 200 to 300 year period in European history, although it has correlatives all over the world, and I began to understand that for 7 generations, literally, people lived in fear that their sisters and mothers and aunties and grandmothers might be arrested and tortured and burned at any moment, really for no good reason. That the feminine kind of went underground at that point, and that we all, again, whether we're currently in a female or a male body, we all inherited some of that fear, I believe, in our bones, in our genetic DNA, perhaps, that you don't go through that extended of a trauma without it carrying on into future generations. When I learned about that, which was in the early 90s, it really affected my worldview. And it was the first time, Amisha, that I began to wonder whether and to what extent my own experience of living in a female body was informing my lived experience. And of course, I realized that it was. And of course, I realized as I began to talk about it, about what my experience was of sitting in a boardroom full of men and having my suggestion fall on deaf ears when a man said the same thing, everybody went, oh, what a great idea, right? I began to realize that when I would share those experiences, women all around me were nodding their heads. And I thought, okay, so there is a wider, more universal experience of being undervalued simply because of our gender. I guess you asked about leadership, and what happened for me was that as I began to be acknowledged for my own leadership with Bioneers, I had a very negative reaction to it. And I realized that I didn't want to be labeled in that way. I felt like it made me a target. And I also didn't feel like I had necessarily earned it. I felt like I was following my own guidance in the best way I knew how. And I was sort of putting one foot in front of the other, like we all do. But I also knew that if so many of the leaders in the Bioneers community were saying what we need most is leadership from everyone, then I knew that my reaction to being called a leader was a problematic thing, and that I needed to investigate that more. And so I began working in workshops and interviews and all kinds of forums to explore what kind of models of leadership I might have inherited unconsciously that could cause me to have that negative reaction. And then what forms of leadership I could wholeheartedly aspire to. Because I have the great fortune of getting to study from hundreds and thousands, really, at this point, of amazing leaders, and see which ones made me want to jump out of my seat and say, I want to work for that one. And so that led me to my first book, which was called Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart. And I'm very proud of that book because it has men in it as well. And because as I read through hundreds of transcripts, I found themes and patterns that describe, for me, the new model of leadership that's emergent. And I don't think that it's just women who are modeling that leadership, but it is a leadership that prioritizes what we love, leading from what we love, and are most passionate about protecting or defending or reinventing. And it certainly integrates mind and strategy, but secondarily to what we love. Of course, in lieu of a solitary leadership model, it is much more collaborative and relational in its nature. So I've been on a long inquiry about women and leadership and about reclaiming the feminine, not just within women, but within us all and within our institutions and our governance. Because as I looked at our bureaucracies and our institutions and how does higher education work and how does governance work, I thought everywhere I looked, I saw the same imbalance of the masculine over the feminine and of mind over heart. And I thought, we have to change it on every level. That's part of the great reinvention that we are faced with, which is both daunting and super exciting.
Mm. It's just this reclaiming of what's sort of been hidden, but then has also been wasted as men, women, institutions have been denied a huge part of their power and possibility.
Yes, and perhaps it's also been honed, right? I mean, part of what I wonder about, Amisha, and I suspect we could talk for hours and hours about this, is how the degradation of the feminine and the misogyny and the violence that women and the feminine have endured for so long may have actually honed us or made the feminine stronger in a certain way, much like the way that I see Indigenous peoples having lived through centuries of attempted genocide has strengthened many of them and their culture. I mean, it has simultaneously weakened them and strengthened them. But isn't that the human condition, right? Our wounds are often our greatest gifts. So I wonder whether the feminine had to be cooked and battered and bruised a bit in order to be able to come forth in a purer and really reignited way right now among all people and from the earth.
I love that way of looking at it.
Well, it's sort of beyond lemonade time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's that correlation to the inner journeys that we go on and how when we're in those spaces where we are pushed into our deepest wounds and we are forced to meet those parts of ourselves and we have to dive deeper and strengthen. And from the outside, it can look like weakness. It can look like we're in a quote unquote bad place or that things are going quote unquote wrong. Yeah. But actually there's so much fertility in that space where we are reclaiming and reorganizing, reopening, replanting.
Well, and as you drew the correlation earlier between our planetary processes and our societal processes and our inner relationship processes, what's been true for me, I am incredibly grateful to say that I'm in a 34-year relationship with my beloved partner and husband, which has endured some very painful and arduous times. We've been through power struggles that, felt like we had to go right through that edge or to the edge of really wondering if we could stay together. in order to break through to a new level. I wonder about whether the divorce rate might be lower if we could cultivate a greater tolerance in ourselves for moving through the places of hardship and pain, because they're also the places that teach us the most. There are ways that I learned so much about the nature of oppression and power dynamics by experiencing, feeling my own sense of powerlessness in that relationship, and seeing with a little embarrassment as I reflect back, but seeing how some of my worst acting out was because I felt so powerless. And it helped me understand something about the revolution that we are heading into, that we're in, I believe already, where those who feel most powerless, and many in the global South, and young people who have chronically been devalued, are rising up and saying, wait a minute, you can't ignore us anymore. I mean, it's funny because I'm not someone who has paid much attention to scripture. In fact, I have a very convoluted relationship to the Catholic Church, but that phrase, the meek shall inherit the earth, has new meaning for me now because of who are rising up and in what ways. And because, I keep thinking of this phrase my father used to say to me as I was growing up, which was, people don't change until it gets really uncomfortable. And I think we as a species are at that point. So the value of going through the darkness, traversing the wound in order to liberate ourselves from it. It's got big value. So how can we reorient ourselves to say, yes, in the interest of growing in freedom and liberation and being my best self, I'm going to keep walking through this rather than turning away.
Thank you. And you were talking about role models. And I think for many of us, especially in younger generations, where there is a tendency to walk away from relationships, romantic relationships, when they get challenging, to hear you talk about a 34-year relationship like that, and for those listening that are new to Bioneers, that you've also been working on such a huge project together for 30 years as well. And a project where your relationship ends up being very visible to a whole team of people, I imagine. Can you share a bit more about how you have managed to hold yourselves and each other in those moments of darkness, or in those moments of challenge?
Because, as you say, our relationship has a sort of public-facing side, oftentimes people will come and project to one or both of us, oh, you're so lucky. You have my dream relationship where you get to work together and live together and be in a romantic partnership. And how lucky for you. And I always want to say, be careful what you set your sights on, because yes, it's profound and beautiful, and it's the hardest thing I could have imagined to take on as a kind of cauldron of growth. When Kenny and I first met, I think that we fell in love partly through an alchemical magnetic attraction that we felt towards each other, but also there was this deep spiritual vision alignment that I think has been able to fuel us through a lot. When we got married, our wedding invitation actually said, in ancient times, a god and goddess got married to save the world. Seems like a good idea to us. And in retrospect, I kind of think, how hubris of us, how young of us,
Bold.
It's bold. But it was what we really felt, and I think one of the things that has been helpful to us is that I once had a therapist who introduced me to a concept that she called balanced mating. And it was about how we are attracted to people in our lives, whether they are friends or work partners or romantic partners, for their difference as much as for their sameness. And often we're attracted to what we see as more developed in them that we know we want to develop in ourselves. And I think that with our particular partnership, over time, part of the gift has been to see how we have grown each other and how we have grown to become more like the other. I can see in retrospect how I've become more decisive, how I've learned to stand more strongly in my own truth, how I have come to trust my own discernment much more and to value my mind and my intellect more. And I can see how Kenny has become more relational, more tender, more empathic, so there are ways that, it gets back to what I was saying earlier about how, my current fascination is in how we learn to value difference. I have a work partnership with a marvelous woman named Rachel Bagby, who you may want to interview someday because she's extraordinary, who is many things. She was trained as an attorney. She's a woman of mixed ethnicity who grew up with parents who were activists and musicians. And she is a farmer and a poet and a facilitator and a change maker and a practitioner. And we have a project together that is about how women bridge worlds. And it has caused us to have to look very closely at our own partnership and say, we do things at different speeds. We have different styles. When we write and edit together, we each bring different gifts to the table. One of my teachers, one of my inner mantras really has become that one of the systems errors that we as humans tend to make is to think that people who think like us are smart and people who don't think like us are not. And actually, nature shows us over and over again that the most resilient ecosystems are the ones with the greatest diversity of species, and that we've all known for a while that collaboration seems like a part of the way forward, but who's teaching us how to partner well, either in work or in romance or in friendship? Who's teaching us how to, navigate the ruptures when they happen? That same teacher taught me that. Her name is Donna Markova, and she's a brilliant author. And she taught me that relationships are a function of rupture and repair. And if you think about it, whether it's, your siblings, your parents, any long-term relationship, all relationships have ruptures. And what she says is the durability and resilience of a relationship is a function of how you navigate the rupture and repair. And because our society tends to be so focused on fast fix and instant gratification, when ruptures happen, we have a tendency to walk away instead of to tending really well to repair. I think that's part of the Earth's assignment to us right now, is how do we repair within ourselves, among each other, and with the Earth, to enter into a new pact of sacred relationship.
I think many of us feel we don't have the skills.
And many of us don't. Most of us probably don't. But there are great resources around. Some of them are coming out of the racial justice movement around repair, and repair on a personal level and reparation on a societal level. Eve Ensler's new book, The Apology, actually does this beautiful job of what does a real apology look like and what does it mean? And so I'm finding one of the principles of relational mindfulness is turning back towards, which is another way of saying, don't leave when the rupture happens. You know, we have a tendency to isolate. That's part of the masculine approach to rupture, is to isolate. What if we choose to turn back towards and get a little less fearful around anger or emotion and say, this is too important to turn away from? Really, it's what the earth is calling us toward, right? We can't continue to turn away from mass extinction and climate change. We have to turn towards it. And young people are modeling some of the best ways, and Indigenous people are as well. You know, we're all students. And I think one of the great lessons of this time is to not think we need to know the answers, right? To be okay with not knowing. I don't know how to repair this, but I'd like to. Do you want to try with me? That might work. Yeah. And truthfully, I mean, as I said, I think, you know, we have a tendency to sort of glom onto an idea as a solution, like partnership or collaboration or shared power, but we don't actually hold ourselves accountable to the how. And we need to learn the how now. You know, we're being called to, and it's not that daunting, but we do have to be okay with saying, I don't know how yet. Can we learn this together? You know, you asked me earlier, what are some of the practices that have helped me in my own quest to reclaim the feminine in myself and toward healthy relationship? And one of them is putting relationship before task. And, you know, because of the Industrial Revolution and neoliberalism and capitalism and all that, we all have become so task-oriented that we tend to look at our to-do list before we connect. You know, what business studies and organizational systems and nature systems are teaching us over and over again is that it's through connection and valuing relationship and reciprocity. That's how the good work really gets done. We have to sort of decolonize ourselves of the idea that bigger and faster and more task-oriented is better, and instead say, no, let's slow down. Let's value connecting eye to eye and taking a pause and listening for what comes in the silence and seeing how we are similar and how we're different, and choosing to consciously navigate the ruptures and repairs. Because to me, that's how I want to move forward. That's the world I want to co-create. When I've been able to create the conditions to experience that in my own life, sometimes in workshops, sometimes one-on-one with a partner, those are the glimmers of the beautiful world that I want to help midwife into form. So those become important benchmarks for me of, oh yeah, I remember how that felt. I want that. Let's co-create that.
Just drinking in that invitation and that reminder. And yeah, that call to I suppose lead by inviting the space for repair. Because I think often what can happen is when one like turns away and it feels, then you think, oh, well, what's the point? But to kind of to keep walking towards and saying like, you know, let's try. And and it's okay that we don't know exactly how to heal this.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a sense, you know, what I'm noticing for myself, Amisha, is that it's so much about prioritizing love. You know, it's like when my mother got sick, there was nothing more important than being there for her. Even though I could see all the ways that I have always experienced her as flawed or imperfect or wounded or controlling, none of that was nearly as important as the call to serve her transition in the most loving, present way I knew how. And so what if we prioritize love? And not only love in all its octaves, love for ourselves, love for this beautiful home we get to inhabit for a time, and love for each other. And say, what connects us is so much more important than what divides us. And that the divides are often systemically reinforced and not of our own true making.
Mm. Thank you.
Well, it's the other thing that I am so aware of right now, Amisha, is that I love being surrounded by teachers, and some of them are nature and plants and trees and rocks, but some of them are human. Dina Metzger, who is a wonderful crone, who has been studying natural systems and how to repair for a long time, wrote an essay recently called Extinction Illness. In it, she suggested that she believes that everything alive on Earth today can feel the loss and the grief of what's happening in terms of the extinctions all around us. And when I read that, inwardly, I knew it was true. It was just one of those things where I went, oh, yes, of course. We are products of human cultures that tend to not know how to grieve and not actually have permissible, expressive pathways for expressing loss or grief. And what she goes on to say is that because we can all feel this, in her observation, everything on Earth is beginning to behave a little abnormally. And again, I had this inner oh yes, that's true. I know that's true. I haven't known quite what to attribute it to. Some part of me has wondered, is it trauma? Is it the uncertainty that we're heading into? Is it the clash between what we're perceiving and our tendency to smooth over or deny the truth of the emergency that we face? But when she published that essay, the magazine she published it in, the two women who were the editors were so moved by it that they invited readers to respond to it. And they got such an overwhelming response that they wound up publishing a whole nother online version of Tikkun, is the name of the magazine, Tikkun. And so I'm finding myself, my way of seeing the world is being somewhat affected by that perception, and by the recognition that, whether it's people of color who know their children are being targeted by racist systems, or Indigenous people who are carrying intergenerational trauma with very good reason, or immigrant people who are carrying those traumas, or everyone else. I actually believe that those who are walking through life with the privilege of having white, quote, white skin have been traumatized by that privilege and the systems of white supremacy in different ways, but perhaps as much as people of color have. So we're all really facing this giant moment of awakening and healing. And really, I think the only way we're going to get through it is together and is to see how we can leverage the particular strengths and capacities and power that we each have to support each other, to support the common good, to support our collective healing, to head into a culture that is truly life-affirming and truly equitable and truly regenerative. But we have to go through the pain in order to get there. I don't think there's any other way.
Do you say that? The sirens.
Exactly. We got some punctuation from Mother Life. Yeah.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty.
There's so many threads that I want to pick up, but one that I'm really curious about is that you shared that there are some incredible examples that you're seeing from young people and young Indigenous people. And I wondered if you could share with us some of what you're seeing and experiencing.
I'm really mindful that the whole Standing Rock experience was begun by Indigenous young people.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is a quality of purity with which some of the young people I know, I think of Shutezcot Martinez, who is a founder of Earth Guardians. And in her own way, I also think of Greta Thunberg, who is modeling the power and beauty of being autistic in a way that I've never seen anyone do before. But in terms of the Indigenous young people, part of what many of them have been fortunate enough to inherit through their elders and their cultures is a sense of the interconnectedness, the fundamental interdependence of humans and Mother Earth, and of the sacredness of that relationship and the primacy of it, the knowing that water is life, and the willingness to take a stand that is so courageous on behalf of that which is sacred to life is something that I feel like we could all learn from. I think it harkens back to, what comes up for me is things that we've already mentioned around sacredness and ritual and taking a stand and being willing to face danger on behalf of what is most sacred. Amisha, I noticed that because there are many, many change makers within the Bioneers world who would self-identify as activists, I've had an interior question echoing through me for some years now, which is, what is worth dying for? It's a question that the more I learn about the civil rights movement, the more the question has deepened for me as I've understood how many people went into situations that they knew would be life-threatening because the stand that they were taking was so essential to them. Ending the Vietnam War, turning to the past examples of earlier phases of the feminist movement where women won the vote. Those women put themselves not only in harm's way, but did hunger strikes and really were willing to risk their lives for a cause. And because my orientation and my personality tends to orient so much towards celebration and buoyancy and love and beauty and connection, it's a question that really challenges me, because I do believe that Creator or Gaia helped evolve us here, partly to celebrate life. So the question of what is worth dying for is a question that I have been gestating for quite some time. What moves me most about the stand that I see Indigenous young people taking is the sacredness of life itself, is what they're willing to put their lives on the line for. I can't really imagine a cause more compelling than that. My own experience of the sacred is that it is everywhere inside of us and throughout the natural world. I am not a follower of a particular faith or a particular religion. I would have to say my sense of the sacred is that it's Gaia, and that includes us, that we are all sacred. Part of, I think, our assignment right now is to remember how sacred we are and how sacred this life is. That willingness to risk a personal life on behalf of the sacredness of all life just really moves me. It speaks to a connection with the invisible world that I admire and respect so deeply, with the ancestors, with knowing that there is much more to living on earth than what we can perceive with these five senses. And it speaks to a deep sense of love and commitment to the world in all her glory.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
It's interesting because so much of our history involves death, whether it's the burning times or any of these movements for big changes, the wars that are happening. I mean, there is a lot of death happening now. There are so many refugees from war, from climate. And then it is this interesting question of those that are not in the path of those elements of death, that are lucky to be sort of safe, quote unquote, in this world, that should we be all making more of a stand with our whole bodies and our whole life? It's so hard, I think, sometimes to get a sense of it all in our modern world, because there are so many threads and mini worlds, like all on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's not kind of like you're in a community where there's one very clear reality.
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes where I question how to serve. Where I've got to is is very similar to your values, you know, to serve the love and the beauty and the truth, and to hold space for myself and for others through the initiatory processes. Keep showing up in that way, and to use my name and my privilege and my voice to challenge parts of the system, and to sign the petitions, and to show up at the demonstrations, and all of these things. But it feels quite abstract within all of that, the thought to go and say, like, despite how much I love trees, or I honor the rights of Indigenous people, and I'm so grateful for everything they do for all of humanity and all of nature. But then to say, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to go now and stay in that forest and stand there until the end. In a world where there's also Netflix and coffee shops on every corner, and you know, the sense of progression, and what about having a family and doing this and doing it? I find it just very hard to grapple that aspect of the urgency. I don't know, just reconcile like where the courage and where the cop-out is in my own sense of comfort and my own sense of knowing that I am here to be part of the shifts and the turning.
I really am appreciating the way that you named that, Amisha, because navigating the fine line, as you put it, between the courage and the cop-out, I feel like we're all doing that all the time. I am in a constant dialogue with myself about the places where I compromise and the places where it's as important to me to love my driving experience as it is to get great gas mileage, right? Like, what's that? I mean, that's not really in alignment with my values. I think the inquiry is part of the assignment right now. And that, you know, part of what I love is that for a very long time, I would not call myself an activist because I did not feel called to direct action and protests and getting arrested. It was not my way. And my path has been one of communicating and convening as a means of hopefully liberating and enlivening people and helping create the conditions for more of us to reclaim more of our own humanity as part of my contribution to the great jigsaw puzzle. But what's comforting to me is the notion that really we each come with our own very unique assignment. And I can't possibly know what yours or anyone else's is. And that in many ways our best service is to help call each other and stand at each other's backs as we experiment and risk and fail and keep learning together and create a kind of collective, collaborative learning field, which feels to me like what you're doing with this beautiful podcast, that gives people a chance to say, how am I navigating the line between courage and cop-out? And where am I today in this? And honestly, I think we have to do it with one of my ways of understanding the balance of the masculine and the feminine is that I think of the feminine as compassion. It's a vast oversimplification, obviously, but I think of them as compassion and rigor. How am I holding myself accountable to living in the way that is truest for this soul, in this body, in this lifetime? You know, I love, there's an ancient myth from the Jewish tradition, which I come from, which says that before every soul is born, it knows its purpose in coming into this lifetime. And that in the course of being born, we forget. But if we are purposeful and intentional and hold ourselves accountable to following the breadcrumb trail of cues and clues that we receive in our lives, if we're lucky and we really want it enough, we can find our way back to that assignment. And that's what I feel like we're all doing. It may not be your assignment to go stand in a tree. You may be living your assignment, I think we each are, in the best way we know how right now. How do we encourage and support each other to keep growing into our best selves while being both rigorous and accountable and forgiving for the ways that we may be compromising or cupping out? Because we all are. It's part of being human. And we live in a tremendously compromised world. I have to remind myself how often I need to be out in wild nature just to rebalance myself. Because it's pretty crazy in the human world these days, as we all know. And it's important to me to feel both the magnificence and the mysteriousness and the beauty and also the loss that's happening in the natural world all at once. And to stay present to that.
Beautiful. As you're talking, one of my friends comes to mind and heart, and she is a very sensitive soul, and for her, being in protests and those kind of spaces, basically torture. It is for me half the time. I have like a way of, sometimes I can get really into that extroverted mode, but it's not all the time. And so I always have to listen to that. But she talks about her activism being sitting at home and crying, and that she feels so much grief about these disconnects that we're in, that we experience. She will sit and sometimes cry for hours with it very channeled around a theme of something that is happening in the world. And often she'll do that outside so the tears can land on the earth. And I just feel like this is one of the beautiful ways that we can all be moving some of this energy through helping it to transform and to be able to regenerate in ourselves.
Well, that's beautiful. And, who is to say that demonstrating has a higher value than creating sacred space in a podcast with people who care deeply about the changes we're all going through? Who's to say that one is more important or useful than the other? As an artist, I'm admiring, and a communicator, I'm really deeply admiring and appreciating your activism in the way that you do this. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about your new book, which is kind of everything we've been talking about, right?
It very much is. My new book is called Nature, Culture, and the Sacred: A Woman Listens for Leadership. What I've learned about writing books is that it helps me to review and distill and refine my own understanding of what I've been learning. So this book is that. It's a combination of poetry that I've written and some essays. It really explores the gendered nature of healing and reality in this time. It explores women's leadership within a global context, and it explores healing within the framework of racial justice and Indigenous worldviews. I'm proud of it because I feel like I took some risks in writing it. I went right up to my learning edges I've been through some rather vulnerable and difficult challenges in my own process of learning about racism and white supremacy and the blinders that I have had and probably continue to have being a product of a racist culture. So I'm hoping it may be useful to other people. It's a beautiful book and has a gorgeous print from one of my favorite artists on the cover. It captures some of the high points of my learning over the last 10 years. What I'm hoping is that it will find pathways, whether people choose to read it before bed reading or in a reading circle or in a classroom. I don't know. What was wonderful with the last book was that I started discovering years later that there were people using it in classrooms on women's studies, in classrooms on leadership, and in classrooms on diversity and inclusion. And I thought, oh, that's great. How wonderful. Who knows? It's my own particular journey of weaving together all these strands. And as I say, I just keep listening for cues and clues and sharing what I'm learning as I go along. Thanks for asking. If people would like to learn more about either the books or workshops that I do or videos, they can look both on Bioneers.org as a website or at ninasimons.com, because all of that is in both places.
Yeah, and Bioneers have been making some beautiful videos recently that really stir and capture.
I'm so happy to hear that you just interviewed Drew Dellinger, because the video that we made of his poem, Hieroglyphic Stairway, is wonderful. All of them are available on YouTube and people can find them there. And there's one called The Promise of Women and Girls that I happen to love for obvious reasons.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Yeah.
Nina, it would be so wonderful if you read us a poem or a piece from your book as a closing to this conversation.
Thank you. I'd be honored to, Amisha. The poem that I'm going to read is called From Morning into Daybreak, and morning is spelled Mourning. How will we ever see daybreak without morning? If we don't feel what hurts, surrender to its demands, speak the wound, how can we really begin to heal? When my father died, I felt the rock I stood on suddenly gone, my identity lost in free fall. A friend warned me it might take a year for me to heal. It was longer, and I was grateful for the crystalline time. Long, elastic months of feeling transparent, of squinting at the striking brightness of colors, lines, and light, of oscillating between emptiness and attunement, the tenderness of tears always a breath away. I was appalled to discover our illiteracy toward death, and I envied a Japanese tradition I'd heard about of wearing a black armband for a year following the loss of a loved one, so that everyone knows not to treat you in the usual way. Walking in the shimmering New Mexico light, a huge crow swoops to meet me. His large beak stuttering open, he croaks his hello, frog-like, focused on me, inciting a conversation. When I respond, he flies closer, perches to stare at me. Beady black eyes glow against shiny indigo feathers. He caws in clusters of 3, his wings inflating with each inhale. My responding calls intrigue him, and we converse, an arc of connection cutting through the apple-crisp autumn air. He pauses, turning his head to an improbable angle to suck water through his long, thin beak from the shallow pool puddled in the cement birdbath. I wonder if he is a bird of sorrow or a creature of connection, and then I know he is both. the poem goes on, but I might stop there because it's a bit long, but it's beautiful. It's what I wrote after my father died, so I wonder what I'll write next now that my mother's died.
Thank you, Nina.
Oh.
Thank you for all of what you're doing and the way that you're giving permission and leading so many of us. I really feel that.
Well, thank you. I mean, all I know is that I'm putting one foot in front of the other in the best way I know how, honestly. I'm really deeply moved and honoring of what you've created here, Amisha, and of the quality and depth of our visit together. I hope we may encounter each other more in the future.
Yeah, I would like that.
Me too. Me too. Let's find a way.
Yes. This time you're in New Mexico and I'm in California. In the buzzingness of San Francisco.
Yeah. Well, maybe in the UK someday. Or somewhere. I don't know where. But I look forward to it and I listen forward to it.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?